Hey there, it's Andrea, and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today I have with me Carlos A. Alvarenga. He is an independent researcher, writer, and coach. And today we're here to talk about his new book, The Rules of Persuasion: How the World's Greatest Communicators Convince, Inspire, Lead, and Sometimes Deceive. So I'll give you a little background first. Before writing full time, he worked as a management consultant and adjunct professor at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. Prior to his current role, he was the executive director of World 50 Labs, the member innovation team at World 50 Inc. Before World 50, he was a principal at Ernst & Young's advisory practice and earlier a managing director at Accenture. Carlos is currently a PhD student in language, writing, and rhetoric, so he has a lot of background and research into this topic. This is at the University of Maryland. He holds a BA in Humanities and Classical Greek from Hampton-Sydney College and completed the post-baccalaureate program in classics at the University of Pennsylvania. He resides in Bethesda, Maryland with his wife, who's a physician researcher at the National Institutes of Health, and is the father of two sons. Carlos, welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast.
Andrea, thank you. Great to be on, and thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Yeah, so first of all, how old are your kids?
One's 17 and the other one is 16. So they're a couple of years apart.
Yeah. Okay, so that's about the age of my kids too. So that's kind of interesting. Have you found this topic of persuasion that that parenting teenagers or parenting your kids as they've grown up, that's actually had some sort of impact on your perspective?
It does, because in fact, one of the examples I talk about when I coach, when I lecture is persuading kids, and how much the character, which is one of the three modes of persuasion throughout the book, has an impact, right? When we say it isn't anything that I would do, right? Or if we say, imagine if your grandparents were watching your behavior, or if you say, imagine that someone's watching what you're doing when no one's there. These are all formulations of persuasion that we use with kids, right? And sometimes people even use religious, right, formulations where they talk about the Bible or they talk about examples from the Bible. So the formulation I discussed in the book, well, we see them at play very early on in our own life as we're influenced by people, and then as we get older and begin to influence others. So yeah, absolutely. It's a critical part of parenting. It's a critical part of almost every job I've ever come across, which is kind of interesting. There's almost no job where being persuasive isn't on the way to success. And it's a funny thing that I always talk about, that imagine if getting a promotion depending on playing the piano, but no one ever taught you to play. So, but they go, look, hey, the VP job is yours. Just go up there and play some Mozart and you're good. And you go, well, I've never played piano. Don't worry, it's fine. Everybody has to play Mozart to become a VP in this company, and you've never had a lesson. And it's a funny thing about persuasion, that it's critical to our lives and to our jobs, and yet it isn't taught anymore, which is one of the reasons I wrote this book.
Mm. Yeah, so Voice of Influence is the name of our podcast. It's also the name of our company. So we're highly interested in this topic, and actually in the difference between healthy and unhealthy influence, which you highlight in the book, the difference between coercion and persuasion. And as you were talking about kids and all that, I was thinking about how like getting them to think about the character of the others around and whether or not that matches the character they want to have and that sort of thing, that can be so powerful. And sometimes it can also turn ugly. It can kind of turn towards shame based stuff. Like, so just since we already started bringing that up, let's just dive into that piece of it. Where do you see the line, or I don't know that there is a line, maybe it's really fuzzy, but where do you see the line, or how do you see the difference between using the, I guess you mentioned character, so that character influence versus coming at it with shame and that sort of thing?
Well, in an abstract sense, shame can be a very persuasive thing, right? When in certain cultures, Japan, for example, to demonstrate shame, remorse, to come across as contrite, and then to say, this is why I shouldn't get maximum sentence, right? Because I really feel awful about what I did. That is an attempt to persuade a judge to be more lenient on you because you claim to have understood the magnitude of your actions. So in and of itself, that's an emotion, right? So the emotion
Sure.
is used in a positive way. Of course, when you use it to damage someone psychologically, then that's an example of the negative side. And to take a little bit of a step back, the core thesis of the book is that persuasion is chemistry with words. So what does that mean? It means that there are three modes, and this is Aristotle's theory of persuasion, which I update in my book. He says there are three modes by which we persuade. The character of the speaker, which can be an institution, a person, a company, the arguments presented, and I say these are things like logic, PowerPoints, graphs, statistics, evidence, proofs, and then the emotion the audience feels. And what I say in the book is, if you think of each of these three things, and you can break each one down to 7 constituent parts. These 21 parts, I argue, think of it as the periodic table of persuasion. Okay. When we create a message, we pick and choose from these 21 elements, and then we deliver that message to someone. If we're effective, the message works. If we're not, it doesn't. The last thing I'll add is that chemistry is amoral. It's neither good nor bad. Now back to your point, right? I can make medicine with it. I can make poison. And so in the hands of a skilled communicator who has good intent, persuasion is a wonderful thing. It gets you to live a better life. In the hands of someone who's corrupt or evil, it can destroy a person, it can destroy a team, it can destroy a company, it can destroy an entire society, which we've seen over again throughout history. So when we think about these formulations, right, shame is an emotion, a negative emotion. It can be used in a positive way. It can be used in a negative way, Andrew.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, so when I like to ask kind of questions that get us to where people are at in their work or their lives, and I'm kind of wondering in terms of the leader who is thinking that, I don't love the word persuasion, it feels salesy or whatever, but I understand that I do have to convince people of things. I want to have influence, that sort of thing. Um, how do they know the difference between when they're being coercive versus when they're being persuasive in a healthy way?
Sure. So let's start with a definition. And the very first question I ask everyone when I coach is describe, define persuasion. Persuasion is dot, 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 period. And I've never had anybody who can do it with confidence. They go, well, it's kind of this, it's kind of that. And I go, it's okay. You're just like everybody else because, again, no one ever taught you. So the definition I work with is persuasion is a demonstration that something is true, parentheses, or seems to be true. That's it, period. This is Aristotle's definition. Now, there are some interesting implications. One is, I don't persuade, truth persuades, right?
Mm.
So if you accept the definition, and I think it's correct, then suddenly to persuade just means to convince someone that something is true. And at a fundamental level, this matters to us because it's a human nature thing. Let's say that you love, I don't know, Forrest Gump, right? You think it's just the world's most amazing movie. And there's something human about wanting me to love Forrest Gump. So you tell me, have you seen this movie called Forrest Gump? I just saw it. It's fantastic. You should watch it. It has Tom Hanks, blah, blah, blah. And then the minute I come back, go, I loved it. It's great. You and I are now a community,
It's so
right?
true. That connection is huge. Go on.
Exactly. So at a basic level, persuasion is wanting others to believe what we believe, wanting others to love what we love, wanting others to honor what we honor, right? So that is the basic sense of the word. And you can't be a leader without this trait,
Hmm.
right? How can you lead if you can't get others to believe what you believe, to honor what you honor, to value what you value? So forget about I'd say what I think are sometimes misunderstood or let's say misinformed definition of this word. The word is a fundamental word of human nature. Understood in its correct context, right? It's essential to almost every job we can think of. Now, to answer your question, coercion, persuasion is getting someone to believe something willingly. Coercion is getting someone to accept something unwillingly. So I tell leaders, here's an interesting question. Let's say you have a big initiative at work, or you have a value statement that you really believe in, and tomorrow you quit. Does the project end with you? Do the values walk out the door with you?
Hmm.
If the answer is yes, you've coerced. If the things live on, even if you're not there, then you've persuaded. And when you put that very simple test, time and time again, I get people who say, you know what, you're right. If I left tomorrow, this whole thing comes to a screeching halt. And I saw it as a consultant. How many times did we have a project and the CAO quits or somebody gets a different job and I get a call saying, hey, the project's canceled because the project sponsor took off, right? For whatever.
Yeah.
So if you leave and your ideas live on, you've persuaded. If you leave and your ideas die, you've either coerced or people were tricking you, right? Which is also either way, you didn't get it right.
Yes. I have a colleague client that worked at a very large and prominent um, computer company, and there was a security issue at play, and the CEO came in and was upset because he had promised that the security thing would go through by a certain date, and it wasn't they were not on track to make the date. He comes in and he kind of yells at everybody like, you're gonna get this is gonna happen, right, and so everybody's like, uh-huh, and then as soon as he walked out the door, they're all like, there's no way this is happening.
And those are such a blatant example, but there are subtle ones. Like I remember one was, okay, your boss stops you in the hallway and tells you about this great business book she read. And she really, really suggests you read it. I mean, really hopes that you'll read it. That has she persuaded you, or is she kind of coercing you? What do you, when you walk away, how do you feel? Do you feel that you were persuaded? Probably not. You feel like, hey, I kind of got bullied into buying this book that I really wasn't going to read. And it's often little things like that that wind up putting you in a position where suddenly your management style is more coercive
Hmm.
because it's easier, right? It's easier. Persuasion done well takes some thought. Coercion is easy. I'm the boss. This will get done, right? And if it doesn't, I'll find somebody else who can. Okay, you want to live in that world? It's typical for life.
I like the way you put that. Oh, so good. So, okay, I heard you talk on another podcast about kind of your own leadership role at a company and how you used to prefer working with or choosing A players.
Okay. Yeah.
And then at some point you kind of made this transition into realizing maybe I would be interested in working with people who hadn't gotten to that level yet. And I'm curious, and this sets us up for more conversation about persuasion, but I'm curious what the what instigated that, or just like what happened.
What
What
happened
are you
was that
talking
I
about?
went to work. I've been lucky enough to work in different parts of the world, and every part sort of teaches you something, right? So I had come up sort of in a very American system where like it's up or out, right? A players and everybody else is kind of disposable. And so you really focus on be the best, work with the best, and forget about the rest, right? As somebody put it to me one time. And then I had a chance to go work in Barcelona. And after a few months in working with the European team, Spanish and Catalan, but also from other parts of Europe, we did one of these 180 feedback things, right? And the feedback I got was, boy, you're awful. All you care about are the A people on the team. If you don't see me as an A player, you don't really have much to add to my role. So I was just blown away. And as I thought about it, I realized you're right. I'd grown up in a different culture. And here the culture was you're managing everybody, not just the superstars. So, and I began to reflect and I thought long and hard about the people guy. And then I realized something, which then changed how I manage for the rest of my life. And that is it's easy to manage great players, right? If Patrick Mahomes is your quarterback, your life is pretty good,
Yeah.
right? The challenge is how do you make them, right?
Mm,
And you make them. The really good manager doesn't manage A players, they make them.
mm,
And so my job became not to find and nurture A players, but to create them. right? And I kind of call sometimes Wizard of Oz management, because what I found over the years is that most people already had it in them. It's just that it had been managed out. And I give you an example: a young woman who might work for me, and she told me when we first met that she was indecisive, and that was her biggest flaw. And people told me, don't put her on your team because she's indecisive. Well, guess what? When I talked to her, I realized that every time she'd made a mistake in the past, somebody had dropped an anvil on her head. And so she became terrified, because when anything went wrong, they all came down on her. And I realized that once I gave her the space to make a mistake, as we all do, she had no problem. She became, a year later, the most decisive, right, sort of take charge person. Once she knew that one mistake wasn't going to get her yelled at or put in a doghouse for a month. And so you go, that was inside of her. My job was to find what is holding you back from being at the same level. And then how do I let you find that or develop that skill? And that completely changed how I manage people.
Mm, that's so great. I love that example. And I know that we're in a place right now where workers are harder to come by. Good, those A players or whatever, they're often getting burnt out anyway, so they may not be able to be the A player all the time. And uh and it's imperative that we develop our teams. So I'm curious how you view that in particular. Would you have called that like management, mentorship, coaching? Does it even matter what you call it?
I think if you call it management, it's important, because oftentimes you'll hear this distinction between how I manage and then mentoring. We see mentoring as a side gig,
Mhm.
or something you do, if you have the time, it's something you can volunteer for. No, I don't see it as an ancillary activity. I saw it as, this is how I'm going to run this team. And my team, I would always tell them, I don't do the work, you do. So I will live and die with all of you. You succeed, I succeed. You don't succeed, I don't succeed. There's not going to be any of this, I did fine, but my team let me down. It's
Mm,
not going to work that way. So to me, it's fundamental. It's how you approach the relationship you have with these individuals who have put an immense amount of trust in you as their leader. People don't think about this. Just think about what it means that this person, whose livelihood, feeding their kids, whatever it is, depends on decisions you make, right? And so my take is, that's a huge trust you gave to me. Now I'm going to return the favor. And if we do it well, right, we're going to be just fine. In my experiences, most of the time we are fine, right? Not that there aren't always going to be people who are a little bit problematic or just have their own way of doing things, but most people, they're driven by a desire to create something, right? A team, a great
mhm.
campaign, a great project. It's a fundamental drive. Recognize that, find the thing that person does really well and brings to that creative effort, and uh, you have great results. We have this false distinction, I think, between creative jobs and business, and I don't think so. I have a lot of friends in the arts, and we always get into this conversation. Business is a creative function, right? You create companies, you create products, you create ideas. So approach it that way, and people respond much better, I think, than it's a task-based, right? Let's lug this rock up the hill kind of role. I think if you approach it as a creative human function, work becomes a lot more interesting.
Yeah, it's creative. It's creative and it's collaborative.
Yeah.
So there's this desire for it's like we're working together to push that rock up
Yeah.
the hill.
We don't want to work alone, right? Even in the arts, people think of artists as this person locked in a room. Most artistic work, theater, museums, right, opera, films, are project-based work. Yes, here and there, people like me sit in a room for 2 years and write a book alone, but that's a very limited part of that world, right? Most creative work, what we think of creative work, is done as a team. And so I think the teamwork, collaboration, is essential to most creative work. And the same thing applies in business. Think about, what are you? It's an interesting question, right? You say, walk into your office tomorrow and say, what do I create this job? What do we create? what is the creative component? Not the entire job isn't creative, but there's a creative component to most jobs. What is that? And do I emphasize that, right, to inspire people who work with me? If I don't, then back to persuasion, you're leaving, right, of an important persuasion element out of your conversations. And this is what I typically find I do when I coach people is that if you think about persuasion as these three modes, right? Who's speaking to me? What are the arguments? What do I feel? Imagine a ship that has three masts. And what I find is that most people in business only have one sail up, and that's argument. And the sail is doing all the work. It's getting pretty tattered, and the boat isn't going very fast. If you suddenly discover that you have, hey, I have a sail called character, I have a sail called emotion, I open those up, they're nicely folded in perfect condition because you've never used them. Now you unfurl those, the wind fills them, and the boat speeds up. And it doesn't take a lot of change. Time and again, what I found is small changes suddenly completely alter how someone is perceived and the persuasive power they bring to a conversation.
Hmm. Okay, so I have this theory about engagement and buy-in, and it is that it's not only about the person sending the message, but also the person receiving the message, that both people have agency, both people feel persuasive and are part of that conversation. And that's when the real engagement happens. What's your take on that?
I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that I talk about in the book, and one reason I wrote the book is that in looking through books on persuasion, quote unquote, I found out they weren't really about persuasion. They were about influence or psychology or manipulation, lots of things except persuasion. And nothing, and nowhere could I find a definition of what exactly persuasion is. So what does it mean? Like psychologically, mechanically, rhetorically, what does it mean? And I found that in another book of Aristotle called the Metaphysics, and it goes something like this, I argue. We are in a kind of pre-audience state normally. We're walking around like a computer on standby, waiting to receive a message. Suddenly, we see an ad. We recognize the ad because it's in our language. We recognize the symbology, right? It's not in hieroglyphics, so we get there's a message there. Then we choose to engage or not. This is the critical moment. The first part of engagement is a release of energy from the communicator. The skill of the ad starts to make the reaction kind of work. But to your point, if the audience doesn't add energy, it's never going to take off. It won't come to life. Now you infuse it with energy. The more you give, the more the message gives, the more energy there is released. With enough energy released, suddenly the message comes to life, as Aristotle says.
Hmm.
That is enough persuasion. The only thing left to figure out is what I call adherence, which is, does it last? Is it gone the next day, or is it last the rest of your life? But this is the key thing. Your job as a communicator is to get that energy flowing. And by the way, this explains why sometimes a communicator is surprised by the reaction, because the audience can be like a battery, right? Full of energy, looking for somewhere to go, right? Energy wants to move. Suddenly, a communicator comes, taps into that, and that bolt of lightning, that energy that's been stored gets released. And even this communicator goes, holy cow, I can't believe the reaction. What you just did was tap into a storehouse of power that was waiting for the right chemistry to release. This happens in politics, it happens in business, it happens in society. And so you're 100% right. There is this mutual exchange of energy and power that, if it becomes strong enough, is when a team, a group, an entire nation is persuaded of an idea.
Mm. That's fantastic. I'm really glad you brought that to my attention. The Aristotle's take on that, and oh, that's so good, because it is so important that people, I think, honor and realize that it's not just about me being persuasive. It's about me tapping into that energy and all that too. That's really good.
How many CEOs do you see where they try to manufacture this incorrectly, right?
Yeah.
We're got a 5-day training thing. Go, I'm so excited to be here. But you're not, right? It's Monday morning. You're not excited. We're not excited. We got to do this, but let's not pretend that there isn't. And then other times there is real excitement, there is real energy, and the leader doesn't tap into it, ignores it, misses it completely. right? And sometimes that energy can be negative. There's anxiety, people are worried, and leaders ignore that energy. Imagine if you could harness that energy in a positive way. That's what great leaders do, right? When you hear these stories and watch these movies about a commander in battle who looks like the odds are against us, and somehow that team pulls it out. What does the team do, right? What the command did was, I'm going to channel the fear, your anxiety, your desire to survive, to make you do superhuman things. Mm. It's phenomenal leadership, which is so different from the leader who goes, you know what, I'm going to ignore that fear, I'm going to ignore that anxiety because I don't have the skill to interact with it. Just really what you're
The
saying.
skill you just said. And I think that's one of the things that you really highlight is that this is a skill. This is something you can learn to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. In fact, when I coach people, they're always amazed. And like somebody who read the book and very smart guy, he's a MBA, and he works with startups to get regulatory approval for new inventions. And he read the book and he said, I have a client, we've been trying to get approval, we couldn't get anywhere. I threw away the PowerPoint deck. I made a completely different presentation where we emphasize the emotional component of the work we're doing and the lives will be affected. And he said, everything changed in one meeting. And he couldn't believe it. And I go, well, look, it's chemistry, right?
Mm.
This is how things work. Chemistry is almost always predictable. And I found the thing about chemistry is, back to leadership, and I think in corporate settings, I tell people, if your message isn't working, take a step back sometimes, because all chemistry requires some things to be true in order to work, right? In other words, this reaction requires temperature range between 10 and 50 degrees. If it's too hot or too cold, it doesn't happen. The same thing happens in business. You should ask yourself, what must fundamentally be true in order for my message to work? And I'll give you an example. Nike has, to my best of my knowledge, never run an ad on the benefits of exercise, although it makes exercise gear. Now, isn't that odd, right? Because they know it's fundamentally true to its customers that exercise is good for the human body. Their job isn't to convince you to exercise, it's to exercise with their stuff or to work out at all. So when you have a leader who's hitting his or her head against the wall, and I say, wait a minute, take a step back. Are you making assumptions either about the workforce, the environment, your competitors, the team, that you believe but nobody else does? Because if that's true, your message is dead on arrival.
Mm.
Now go back and ask yourself, what must fundamentally be true for it to work? Am I in the right temperature range for this reaction to work? Suddenly you change the temperature and the chemistry works, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's remarkable how people will come back to me and go, I can't believe it was that easy. And I go, well, that's because you were just missing an ingredient, right, from the recipe. Once you added the catalyst, everything happened. That's all you
Yeah.
were missing, which is
Yeah.
really, it's the fun part of the work, is to make somebody say, okay. Then once they see it, they don't unsee it. They go, okay, get it, right? I just hadn't thought of it this way before. Mhm.
Yeah, I love that. The assumptions. There's also something else that you talk about where you can overshare when it comes to the logic or the
Mhm.
argument, and that can just lose people.
Yeah, it's funny. I work with people who are often CEOs and founders, and it's the nature of that kind of person that they are persuaded by statistics often, right? They are very analytical, and I tell people, the more you are persuaded by statistics and logic and argument, the farther away you are from persuading the average person, because the average person doesn't work well with this for two reasons. One is we're not fast processors for the most part, right? And two, it's hard to get logic right. And so we've almost all been in a room where someone's trying to make a little bit of extended argument. And after a minute, we're like, huh, I forgot, like I lost my place here, right? And so it takes a lot of training to be able to follow logic at a high level, an argument at a high level. And most people don't have it. And so a mental discipline, which means that sometimes you want to just dial that back or deliver it in a different format. Right? I'll give you a really good example. I work with a person who was an executive in a fashion company, and she loved spreadsheets. Boy, right? It's statistics and analytics. She felt like emotion has no place. This is the workplace, blah, blah, blah. I said, And she kept saying, I'm not as effective as my peers. And the example was there was a project that had failed. So she wanted to do a very analytical tear down of the project and why it had failed. I said, I get this, but Joyce, they're not going to follow you. So why don't we do this? Why don't you tell a story about something that went wrong on the project that you heard from one of the team members? Tell a story. Take everything that's in this analytical package and just re-deliver it. Right? Same information, but in the form of a narrative, a personal narrative. People will follow the story easily. They'll get the same information, but it's like whether I deliver medicine to you in a cup or in a tablet, right? And so is it 5 injections or 1 pill a day, right? So let's stop with the 5 injections, which are almost as painful. Let's give somebody a little sugary pill to take, and the effect will be the same. And her effect, her persuasiveness just became so much higher because suddenly she was delivering the same information in a different way. So that's the other part, right? To you point about audience, I stress delivery method.
Mm.
Video is not audio. People may see this podcast, they may hear it. They could read the transcript of our conversation. Each modality has different pros and cons. And it's very common that people don't think about this and say, how do I come across on video? How do I come across on audio, in person, et cetera, right? So that's one other element to consider.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah, so striking that right tone from the get-go, that seems like it's a really important piece of this. And then I also think about credibility. You that comes up in the book as well. Um what does it take to be credible in the eyes of others while not and I live in the Midwest where you don't just brag about yourself. You just don't do that. In fact, I was doing a workshop about a week ago and it was like, well, we definitely can't share this about ourselves. Like, well, can you share it about each other? But anyway, but highlighting one's credibility so that you don't lose
Let's talk about that.
anything.
This is one of my favorite topics, this authenticity, right? So
Yeah.
in the book, I talk about authenticity and I say, look, my take on this is a little bit different because I think of it, and I want to use a term loosely, mathematically. So what does that mean? Let's say that you make a claim about yourself. And because I don't know anything the contrary, I'm going to assign that claim a value of 1. Let's say I'm from Philadelphia, diehard Philadelphian. And as you start talking to me, you don't know Drexel's in Philadelphia. You've never had a cheesesteak. You didn't know there was a river called the Schuylkill. So what happens? Your 1 score becomes 0.9, 0.8, 0.6, 0.5, until by the end of the talk, I don't believe you've ever been to Philadelphia, right? So you've lost authenticity, right? Now the opposite happens, which is we start talking. You mentioned UPenn, you mentioned Terminal Market, you mentioned the Philly fanatic. After a little while, I go, you must be from Philadelphia. And you say, born and bred. Now you go from 0.3 to a 1. So this is controlled by the audience, not us.
Mm.
We make the claim, but the audience scores it, right? So, and it's typically about character for the most part. So what I tell people is when you make claims, implicit or explicit, about character, about who you are, right? Your history, your origin, what you've done in the past, what you believe, the audience will immediately score it. If the score holds or get better, you will be seen as authentic and therefore more credible. If the score begins to drop, right, then you will be seen as less authentic and thus less credible. Accents, for example, right? I heard the story of a professor who at Chapel Hill, who his whole life taught with a British accent. When he retired, people found out he wasn't British. He had
It's
gone
like
to the
Ross on Friends.
yeah, he just convinced everybody that he was. And so, for some whatever reason, he felt maybe I'm more persuasive if I sound English. But people do sometimes, they use little words, right? Phrase politicians will do this. So even things like style, certain phrases, right, that signal to the audience, hey, I'm one of you. That's great as long as you back it up. As
As
long
long as
as
it's true.
long as it's true. Exactly that. But that's it. If you stick to who you are, which is usually the easiest thing, right? Then the audience gives you a pretty high score usually.
Yeah. I love authenticity. That's a great conversation. Okay, sentimentality.
Oh yeah.
So curious about this. I do not want to leave this conversation without going there. Um, First of all, would you define sentimentality for us?
Mhm. So sentimentality is a feeling that is unearned or artificial or forced. Right. So, which I'd make a distinction from emotion, which is a feeling which is earned, genuine, unforced. So the example I use is a Hallmark card. Right? So you buy a Hallmark card for Valentine's Day, there's always something written inside. What's written inside, we add to it almost always. We then have the big space to put dear, whoever. What's written in the card is sentimental. What you add is emotion.
Mm, mm,
That's it. So when you feel, when you watch a bad movie and at the end the character is dying and a lot of strings come in and a lot of sad music and people are crying, you go, yeah, I don't really care, right? That's sentimentality. That's a director trying to trick you to feeling something, which is different from a movie where you've invested in the character, you really believe this person had a real existence and a real transformation. And with the slightest sound, your heart breaks with this person, right? And so that's emotional, an emotional moment. And this is one reason why people don't do this in business. Because they don't understand the simple distinction. What happens is they shoot for emotion and land in sentiment. And I see this every single day, right? By companies, by otherwise very, very bright and talented people, because they haven't learned this division and how to generate emotion. Again, we're all excited. That's an emotion. Are you? You don't look excited. I don't feel excited. So why are we talking about excitement? Right? That's you're trying to generate a sentimental reaction for me when what you could be doing is getting an emotion reaction from me. And that's why when someone does hit the emotional button correctly, it's overwhelming, right? Or it can be. And that's the power of it. And emotion has this remarkable thing that because there's so much sentimentality around, especially now, because it's even worse now than 20 years ago, because TikTok, Instagram, they're platforms that are the fuel is sentiment,
mm,
right? The fuel is sentiment. Oh, I just love this cause. I love this dress. I love this person. I love this food. I love this meal, right? Really? There's all this fake emotion so that we're overwhelmed by it. So when we see the real thing, we're drawn to it, the
mm.
tremendous magnetism, right? And the ability to find an emotional connection with an audience is one of the greatest things that a person can have in any setting. And it's not that hard to do. All you have to do is ask yourself, what emotion do I want you to feel? And then understand what gets that emotion and then practice bringing it out. Right? If I wanted you to feel inspired after an interview with me, I have to engineer that into the conversation. If I wanted you to feel intrigued, I wanted you to feel angry, right? So the great communicators have thought about when the talking stops, what does the audience feel?
Mhm.
That is a key part of any message, short or long, that they deliver to anyone. And we do it
Mhm.
with our kids, right? This is almost innate. We're back to parenting. A big part of parenting persuasion is emotional. We're trying to elicit a certain feeling in our children: pride, inspiration, remorse, shame, whatever. And so, yeah, we do a better job with our kids typically than we do with our colleagues. And so, like character, this is one of those things where a little bit goes a long way
Mm.
and it's not that hard, but there are a few rules you want to know before you start working in this space. But get it right, and it's dynamite.
Yeah. You talk about the emotional, so on page 153, a correct emotional response, a just feeling of sadness, anger, joy, and so on is earned.
Right.
As a result, the feeling seems authentic, not forced or artificial. Sentimentality is a feeling that somehow seems unjustified or unearned. For we sense that a communicator is manipulating us into feeling something we should not be feeling. People, I think a lot of times people recognize that. I don't know if every time people recognize that. What are your thoughts?
I think usually, even if we can't put our finger on why, we have a sense that something's not right, right?
Mm,
Something's not right. There's something's a little bit off from this because when it's correct, it's so strong, right? We have this sense of, I had a boss who say, when there's a doubt, there is no doubt. So, this person seems a little bit too friendly, a little bit too concerned, right? It doesn't, you know, fit the measure. It's the really key thing. And real emotion, like I say, has to be earned,
mm,
right? For example, if you see somebody say, I support cause X, but you've never talked about it in your whole life. Well, suddenly you became concerned with cause X. What happened? Right? You've been on Earth for 25 years or 45 years. You didn't care about cause X. Now you care about cause X is the most important thing in the world for you. Well, you haven't earned the right to care about cause X, which is so different from somebody who says, for 20 years, I worked on cause X, never told anybody. Suddenly they talk about it, and you're just like, whoa, okay, what
yeah.
do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? And so this sense of having earned, I saw it into the other day with a military person who had the military couple, the wife had died in Afghanistan, and the husband was doing the interview. The interviewer, very clumsily, I thought, brought up the death of the wife. The husband didn't at all. The interview decided to bring up the death to get some sentimental feeling for this husband. The husband hadn't discussed it at all. Had the husband brought it up in the right way, I think most people would have thought, wow, I didn't even know. This is why he's doing what he's doing. This is why he does what he does, right? I found that on my own. I go on Wikipedia, I look up this person, I go, he's lost his wife in Afghanistan. That emotional response is strong. Because the host, in a clumsy maneuver, brought it up when the person obviously didn't want to talk about it, it became a cheap, sentimental moment, right?
Yeah.
So we know this. You don't have to get a PhD writer to figure this out. We
Hmm.
just know there's something off about this. Just the way we know when we read about your background that you suffered a tragedy 20 years ago, and that's why you started a foundation or why you've worked your whole life to help others avoid the same fate. The emotional component is the feeling we feel is so completely different. And that's why I think in leadership and in communicating with our teammates and with those around us, a little bit of emotion is much better than a whole bunch of sentiment,
Mm.
right? You don't need a lot, just a little, because it's very concentrated. It's like those things you only add one part and then a whole bunch of water, right? Whereas sentiment is the water, emotion is the thing you add to the water.
Mm.
Get
Mm.
that right, and everything works fine. And again, it just takes a little bit of thinking, and then you're fine. We do it all the time in other settings, right? For some reason, we get it to work. It's like the skill goes away. You go, well, it doesn't have to. Just think about it for a minute. You're gonna be fine.
Do you think the overuse of sentiment has driven some of the push towards stoicism? There's quite a few people that want to maintain an even emotional core. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think also sometimes people say they're Stoics, but they haven't really studied the Stoic philosophy, right? And so what Stoicism says, and you think about people like Seneca and others and Cato, it says you feel the emotion, but you don't let the emotion determine how you react to it, right?
Mm,
So there's a metaphor of you're the boulder hit by the waves. The boulder gets wet, the boulder is cold, but it doesn't stop being a boulder because it gets hit by the waves, right? And so the idea is not that you're not sad. You are sad. But the Stoic philosophy accepts that you're going to feel sad because a tragedy befell you. It just says that when the moment comes to make important choices, that sadness isn't the ultimate determining force, right, on that thing. So
mm,
I think to say that Stoic is that I don't feel emotion, no, that's a misunderstanding of Stoicism.
mhm,
Stoicism says I recognize it, I empathize with it, I respect it, but I won't let that be the reason I quit today, right? Or I won't be that reason that I am angry, yell at my kids because I'm angry,
Hmm.
right? So I think that you're right though, in the sense that the overabundant sentimentality will cause a lot of people to go, you know what? I don't want to feel anything. There's a thing, kind of emotional fatigue that occurs where I've been bombarded with cause after cause, sentiment to sentiment, so I just close up. This
Hmm.
is one of the dangers, right? And I think this is what happens, that you over sentimentalize things, and then people forget how to feel about real things
Hmm.
because we could become numb to it.
Yeah.
And this is one of the negative effects of in society today. If you ask me what are some of the effects, the bad effects of social media from a persuasion or from a language standpoint, you hit the nail on the head. One of the worst things is over sentimentalizing. And whenever I see a politician or a CEO or anybody else who goes to sentiment all the time, I get very suspicious. It means you're not in control of the message, or you're trying to trick me, or both, right?
Fair.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. So just closing this up with the tech side of things. So, um, when you look at the future of AI algorithms in the coming years, what questions or recommendations do you have for those employing those technologies? And, from that perspective, your perspective of persuasion.
A couple of thoughts. One is, I gave a talk about my book at a journalism school, and a student asked me, "Is persuasion a uniquely human activity?" And I said, "Well, it depends on whether you believe in God or not. Because if you believe in God, it's also a divine. Because if you look at the Abrahamic faiths, God, Allah, persuades with the same techniques, right? The prophets use the same techniques. And so, because they're talking to human beings, probably you'd say they have to. Then he said to me, "Well, what about machines?" And I said, "Oh, that's an interesting question, because there it remains to be seen." When IBM had the Watson project, I think concurrently there was a project called Project Debater, and it was the same thing. Its job was to beat a person in a debate. The project failed. And there's a great interview with the team on YouTube you can watch. And at the end, the project manager says, "We couldn't do it. It was much harder to win a debate than to beat somebody in chess." And so, at least with the methods we use. So for now, persuasion remains a human activity. So back to your question. First issue for me is, will there be machine persuasion? And will it operate by the same rules that I talk about in the book, or will it operate by different rules? I'm not sure. I suspect the former, but maybe not, right? And then second, how will what AI brings to us affect our ability? And let me give you an example. I tend to not think about AI as artificial intelligence. I think of it as augmented. What does that mean? It means that what Google did was it augmented memory, right? Because of Google, we don't have to remember all the presidents, right? Or what year did Martin Luther post his thesis, right? Or when did Jackie Robinson play? Because we have this portable memory that we carry around with us called Google. So along comes ChatGPT and says, you know what? Here's part two, and that's augmented processing. You don't have to read 1,500 books on the Battle of Hastings. I just did it, and here's what you need to know. So what we're adding is like bolt-ons, accessories, right? First, a whole bunch of memory, just called Google. And in the near future, a whole bunch of processing speed capability, which will be called whatever it's called, right? So you say, what does that do? Back again to, it has good and bad. On the one hand, we could say, I want you to analyze the last 1 million tweets posted, right? Or X things posted, and tell me, where are people lying? And the machine does it and does it. And it comes back in 5 minutes and goes, here's the breakdown. I couldn't do that as a human being. So my ability to detect corrupt persuasion goes up. On the other hand, I make a machine that says, and I was talking with an AI person just last Friday, and I said, what if I just create a persuasion machine? Its job is to take the following message. Andrea Wenberg is the world's greatest podcast host. And I want you to embed this in every single conversation on Facebook for the next 30 days in some way, shape, or form. Okay. And it could do that. And
Sounds
a month,
great.
sounds great. Well, a month later, boy, that Andrea, she's amazing, right? You go, okay, here's the bill, Miss Van Berg, right? Pay up. And so my persuasion machine did its job. If that, and we've already seen the precursor of this in the last couple of elections. Now somebody perfects that machine and sends it out into the world, and who knows the damage it could do. So yes, right. What we're seeing here is augmentation of both the ability to persuade, which can be good or bad, but also maybe on the good side, the ability to detect the worst kind in a way that we couldn't do before, right? And so we now have what I call persuasion factors in the book, which are both machine and human based teams that will do what I just said, not at that scale, but at the beginning of this. So we're entering the age of persuasion factories that are automated in many ways. We're already there.
Mhm.
So the other interesting thing about technology is this, and I talk about it in the book. Video has had a what I call it's had a persuasive primacy for like 50 years, right? Since the very first commercials. If we saw it, we believed it. That that unique trait is dying
Mhm.
in the end of this, right? And there are different consortiums now trying to embed metadata into video, into photographs, for example, as well, where the photograph gets authenticated by the camera, believe it or not. And so in other words, we can't trust our eyes.
Mhm.
This is a pretty scary thing because without thinking about this in all of our lifetimes, if we saw it, it was probably true.
Yeah.
If you saw George Floyd being attacked, it probably happened. What about a world in which I can manufacture a video of a policeman doing A, B, or C, and it looks 100% real?
Yeah.
By the time we realize it, right, think people are dead or things
Mhm.
have happened. So you're right. There's a I think a battle of persuasion at the international level that is both human and technological. And it's one of the things that I study and look at, and it's a fascinating evolution to watch, especially over the course of the next year, right? I would say the America has a Super Bowl of persuasion every 4 years,
Yep.
and ours is getting started.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to look at in the next right between here and November. Mhm.
Oh, yeah. Well, oh my goodness, Carlos, I just love this topic. I love tapping into your expertise here. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for writing this book. Where can people find you and the book?
The book is available on Amazon, on audiobooks. It's Kindle, Audible. So if you've got Audible, it's already incorporated to Audible. So I did the narration for it, so I apologize for any errors right here. So if you like to
I
listen to
love it
books,
when the author narrates, though. It's so much better than some like fake voice. I love it.
it's a process to sit in a
Yeah, it
booth
is.
and read your own book, but it's there. So if you like to listen to books, go right ahead. You can find out more about my writing or even contact me on carlosalvarenga.com. Just look
Okay.
my name on the web and it comes up.
And my last question for you that I ask all podcast guests is what last piece of advice do you want to give to somebody who would like to have a voice of influence?
The most important of the three modes is the character of the person speaking. Everybody I've worked with has something in who they are that makes them more persuasive. Almost everybody I work with hasn't realized that when we meet. Find that thing about your history, about what you believe, about who you are. If it's authentic, it'll make you more persuasive the instant you start to use it.
Hmm. Thank you so much for being a voice of influence for our listeners today, Carlos.
Thank you for having me, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.
Sorry, just a second. We'll cut that. There it is.